The soft hum of the ceiling fan mixed with the distant sound of crickets outside my window. The air was warm, thick with the remnants of the summer heat, making the sheets feel heavier than usual. I shifted onto my side, exhaling slowly, trying to force my body to relax, but sleep wouldn't come. It wasn't the house, it was the unfamiliarity of being here. I had stayed over at Eric's house countless times before. His place had become my second home over the years. Video game marathons, movie nights, sneaking snacks from the kitchen at midnight. It had always been comfortable, but tonight felt different. Maybe it was because Eric wasn't here. He had mentioned something about his girlfriend wanting to talk, so he'd gone over to her place after dinner, promising he wouldn't be too long. I didn't mind. His dad, Mr. Calloway, had always been around, and I had never felt out of place. But tonight, something lingered in the air. I turned onto my back, staring at the ceiling. The moonlight filtering through the curtains painted faint silver lines across the room. The house was eerily quiet now, except for the occasional creak of the floorboards settling. Then a sound, a soft knock. It was barely audible, just a gentle tap against the wooden frame of the door. My breath caught slightly, my pulse quickening. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe the wind. Maybe I imagined it. But then, the door creaked open. A shadow stood in the doorway, unmoving. The dim glow from the hallway barely illuminated his frame, but I didn't need to guess. Mr. Calloway. I swallowed, my throat suddenly dry. Why was he here? Can't sleep? His voice was low, steady, almost too casual. I forced a small nod. Yeah, just not used to the heat. He stepped into the room, just enough for the light to catch his features. He was still dressed in the dark t-shirt and sweatpants he had worn earlier, his hair slightly tousled. I had always thought he looked younger than he was, maybe because he stayed in shape. But now, standing there in the dim light, he seemed different, more intense. The silence stretched between us, thick and charged. I should have said something, should have broken the tension, but I didn't. I just watched as he hesitated, standing at the threshold of the room before finally saying, I didn't mean to wake you, just wanted to check in. And with that, he turned and disappeared back into the hallway, leaving me wide awake and unable to shake the feeling that something had just shifted between us. I didn't sleep that night. Even after Mr. Calloway left, his presence lingered in the air, an invisible force pressing against me. My mind kept replaying the way he stood in the doorway, hesitant, like he had something else to say, but thought better of it. Why did it feel so different this time? I turned onto my side facing the window, trying to push the thoughts away. Maybe I was overthinking. Maybe I was just restless. But deep down, something told me I wasn't imagining things. The next morning, the house was quiet when I woke up. The sun streamed through the blinds, painting golden patterns across the walls. I stretched, my body still heavy with exhaustion, before checking my phone. No messages from Eric. I frowned. He had said he wouldn't be gone long, but now it had been all night. I shook off the unease and swung my legs over the side of the bed. As I stepped out into the hallway, the smell of freshly brewed coffee filled the air. Mr. Calloway was awake. I hesitated for a second before making my way downstairs. He was in the kitchen, leaning against the counter, his eyes focused on the newspaper in front of him. He looked up when he heard me, his gaze unreadable for a moment before he gave a small nod. Morning, he said. His voice was deep, steady, but something about it felt forced. Morning, I replied, rubbing the back of my neck. Eric's still out, he said casually, taking a sip of coffee. Guess he crashed at his girlfriend's place. I nodded, pretending it didn't bother me. It wasn't like Eric had never ditched me before, but this time felt different. Mr. Calloway gestured toward the coffee pot. Want some? I hesitated. There was something strangely intimate about sitting in the kitchen alone with him, like we had been left in a space that wasn't meant for us. But I nodded anyway. Sure. I sat at the table as he poured a second cup, sliding it across to me before settling in the chair across from me. The silence stretched, filled only by the faint ticking of the clock on the wall. Then he sighed. Did I wake you last night? I swallowed, my fingers tightening around the mug. No, I was already awake. He nodded slowly, his fingers drumming against the side of his cup. I shouldn't have come in like that. Didn't mean to make things weird. Weird. That word sat heavy between us, the unspoken weight of something neither of us were willing to name. It's fine, I said quickly, forcing a small smile. I just wasn't expecting it. He held my gaze for a second too long before looking away. Yeah, me neither. Something about the way he said it made my stomach tighten. I took a sip of coffee, trying to ignore the way my hands felt unsteady. Then out of nowhere, he asked, "You ever feel like you're waiting for something to happen, but you don't know what?" I blinked, caught off guard. "What do you mean?" He exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "Forget it. Just thinking out loud." But I didn't forget it. I couldn't, because I knew exactly what he meant. The rest of the day passed in a blur. Eric finally texted around noon, saying he was staying another night at his girlfriend's place. That meant I was here, alone with his dad. I told myself it didn't matter, that nothing had changed. But as the evening rolled in, I found myself hyper-aware of every movement, every glance, every second that stretched too long. By the time it was past 11, I was exhausted again, but I knew sleep wouldn't come easy. I was halfway through changing into my sleep shirt when I heard it again. The knock. Software hesitant, like last night. I froze, my heart slamming against my ribs. I turned slowly, my breath catching as the door creaked open just enough for me to see him standing there. Mr. Calloway. His expression was unreadable, his jaw tight, his fingers gripping the edge of the doorframe like he was debating whether to step inside. A slow inhale. Then, barely above a whisper, "Can we talk?" I swallowed hard, nodding. He stepped inside, closing the door softly behind him, and suddenly the air between us felt too heavy, too charged, too dangerous. But neither of us moved. The silence in the room stretched between us, thick and charged. Mr. Calloway stood near the door, his fingers gripping the frame as if grounding himself, while I sat frozen on the edge of the bed, my pulse hammering in my ears. He hadn't moved any closer, but his presence alone filled the room, making it feel smaller, the air heavier. I swallowed, my throat dry. You, you said you wanted to talk?" He exhaled, running a hand through his hair before nodding. "Yeah, He hesitated, searching for the right words. His usual confidence, the easy charm he carried, was missing. Instead, he looked uncertain, almost vulnerable. I had never seen him like this before. He finally spoke. "Last night when I came to check on you, He stopped, exhaling sharply. "I shouldn't have done that, not because it was wrong, but because I don't know what I was doing." His honesty caught me off guard. "What do you mean?" His eyes met mine, and for the first time, I saw something I couldn't name. Something deeper than hesitation. Something heavier than guilt. "I think I've been ignoring something for a long time," he admitted quietly. My stomach twisted. "What are you talking about?" He let out a humorless laugh, shaking his head. "I don't even know where to start. Maybe it's because Eric isn't here, and the house feels different. Maybe it's because I'm realizing how much things have changed." He sighed. "Or maybe it's because, for the first time in a long time, I don't feel like I have to pretend." His words sent a jolt through me. I gripped the sheets beneath me, grounding myself. "Pretend what?" His gaze was steady, unwavering. "That I don't see things. That I don't notice things." I felt my breath hitch. "Like what?" He exhaled, stepping just a little closer, still keeping a respectful distance, but enough that I could feel the weight of his words before he even spoke them. "You," he said softly, "the way you look at me, the way I—" He stopped himself again, shaking his head as if frustrated with his own thoughts. "It's complicated." I swallowed, my heart slamming against my ribs. "Then say it. Make it simple." He let out a slow breath. "I don't think I can." The room felt like it was closing in, the space between us charged with a tension that neither of us had the words to define. It wasn't inappropriate, but it wasn't easy either. It was something else entirely, something raw and unspoken. I wanted to say something, anything to break the moment before it swallowed us both whole. But my mind was blank, my body frozen in place. Then, he took a step back. His eyes dropped to the floor, his jaw tightening. "I shouldn't be here." And just like that, the moment shattered. The weight of everything that hadn't been said lingered in the air as he turned, reaching for the door handle. I sat there gripping the sheets, my mind spinning. I could stop him. I could let him go. But before I could decide, he looked at me one last time, his expression unreadable. Then he opened the door, stepped into the hallway, and disappeared. And I was left alone, wide awake, heart pounding, wondering if I had just let something slip away forever, or if this was only the beginning.
The house felt emptier after he left the room. I sat there for what felt like hours, staring at the door as if he might change his mind and walk back in. He didn't. The only sound was a faint ticking of the clock in the hallway, marking every second that passed, every moment that widened the space between us. Eventually, I forced myself to move. I peeled back the covers, my body heavy as I shuffled toward the bathroom. Splashing cold water on my face did nothing to clear my head. The reflection in the mirror stared back at me, eyes wide, skin still flushed from what exactly? It wasn't like anything had actually happened, but it almost had, and that was the part one couldn't shake. I spent the rest of the night lying awake, staring at the ceiling, listening for any sound that might tell me he was still awake too. If he was, he never came back. By morning, I knew I had to face him. I could hear movement downstairs. Cabinets opening, the clink of a coffee mug, the low murmur of the TV. He was already up. I hesitated at the top of the stairs, gripping the railing like it might hold me together. I told myself it was just another morning. Just another morning. But when I walked into the kitchen, his back was to me, and he didn't turn around right away. "Morning," I said, my voice scratchy from lack of sleep. A pause. Then, "Morning." His voice was steady, normal, like nothing had happened. I swallowed hard and pulled out a chair at the kitchen table. I didn't want coffee, but I poured myself a cup anyway, just to have something to do with my hands. The silence stretched between us, thick and unspoken. I finally broke it. "About last night." He tensed, gripping the edge of the counter before slowly turning to face me. His expression was careful, measured, but there was something underneath it, something I recognized. "You don't have to say anything," he said quickly. I frowned, but He exhaled, shaking his head. It was a mistake. The words hit harder than I expected. I forced a laugh, but it fell hollow. "You don't mean that?" His jaw tightened. "I do." Liar. I knew it. He knew it. But he was choosing this. He was choosing distance. I felt something cold settle in my chest. "Right," I said, pushing back my chair. "Got it." I stood up too fast. My hands clenched at my sides. But before I could leave, he stepped forward, his voice softer now. "It's not," he sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "It's not that simple." I turned to him, meeting his gaze. "It could be." For a second, just a second, I saw it. The hesitation, the war inside him, the part of him that wanted to take back what he said. But then, like always, he buried it. "It can't," he said, and that was that. I nodded once, swallowing the lump in my throat. Then I should probably go. He didn't stop me, didn't say a single word as I grabbed my bag and walked out the front door. But as I stepped onto the porch, the morning sun warm against my face, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. Not yet. The drive home was a blur. I barely remembered tossing my bag onto the passenger seat, barely noticed the houses passing by, the streetlights flickering in the early morning haze. My mind was stuck on him. On the way he looked at me before I left, on the way his voice had faltered just enough for me to hear what he wasn't saying. It was over, except it wasn't. I gripped the steering wheel tighter, exhaling through my nose, trying to shove down the frustration bubbling in my chest. He wanted to pretend nothing had happened. Fine. He wanted to act like last night was a mistake. Fine. But the way he looked at me, the way he hesitated, that wasn't nothing. That wasn't a mistake. That was fear. and fear meant something was there. I pulled into my driveway, shutting off the engine but making no move to get out. My phone vibrated against the console. I grabbed it without thinking, expecting a message from Eric, maybe an excuse about ditching me all weekend. But it wasn't him. Unknown number. We need to talk. My breath hitched. I stared at the screen, my heart pounding against my ribs. The message wasn't signed, but I didn't need a name to know who it was. Mr. Calloway. My fingers hovered over the keyboard, 1,000 responses running through my head. What was there to say? He made his choice, didn't he? He told me it was a mistake. Told me it couldn't happen. But he was the one reaching out. He was the one who couldn't let it go. I swallowed hard, my thumb hovering over the keyboard. I could ignore it, walk away before I got pulled into something even more complicated. But instead, I typed 2 words. When and where. I hit send before I could think twice. The 3 little dots appeared, then disappeared, then appeared again. I held my breath. Then, tonight, my place. No one else will be home. I exhaled slowly, my fingers tightening around the phone. So much for it being a mistake. I leaned back against the seat, my pulse a steady, insistent drum in my ears. I had a choice. I could walk away, pretend like he did, or I could go and finally, see what happened when neither of us had anywhere left to run. The clock on the dashboard ticked forward, and I knew, deep down, I had already made my decision.